My name is Canucci Taranella. I'm the executive director of the Wenatchee River Institute. I'm so excited to be partnering with Northwest Audubon to have this event for its 22nd year. I've got Jeremy here helping me with the audio and the video online. So on top of the 85 of us that are here in person, there are dozens more listening on the World Wide Web. Also, we got Lissy and Paul serving beverages. Lissy's over here, Paul's in the back. So do make their time worthwhile as volunteers here. And we also have Jackie from A Book for All Seasons with all the books. So thank you for that. WRI has the privilege of having a voice in our community, and it's important for us to use that voice to speak for those that were here before us. I'd like to take a moment and read the land acknowledgement that we developed with the Piscosa people, and I'll read it so I say it in the way in which it was intended. This land acknowledgement was created alongside the Shinpesquawshu people. We are spreading the message they wish to be spread to the public. The land Wenatchee River Institute sits on is the ancestral homelands of the Shinpesquawshu, the Piscosa or Wenatchee people. The Shinpesquawshu means the people in between. They had villages positioned along the Wenatchee River and surrounding areas. Their ancestral homeland extends from the Cascade Ridge throughout what is now known as Wenatchee and Okanagan valleys. The culture and economy of the Shinpesquawshu people centers on taking care of the land. They fish, hunt, gather roots and berries, basket-making materials, and medicines. The Shinpesquawshu are named within the Yakima Treaty of 1855. Language to establish the Wenatchee Reservation was never followed through, even with the needed surveying completed. Many Shinpesquawshu now live on the Colville Reservation, 150 miles from here. They were forced off their land here, and the U.S. government moved them to this reservation. The Shinpesquawshu are still alive today. They continue to practice their culture, harvest their traditional foods and medicines, and hold their ceremonies passed down from their ancestors. Most people won't see or notice them, but they continue to be on the land they are connected to. Their traditional language is Inham-Sheen, which is an interior Salish dialect, and we'll now welcome you to this event by saying hello in their language, Tilhusht. Thanks. We offer this land acknowledgement as the first step to amplifying the indigenous voices and recognizing the harm done to them as a people. We stand as an ally to recognize their connection to the land and their rights to practice their culture on these sacred lands. We encourage all to learn about the indigenous peoples of this place you now call home. The Wenatchee River Institute is committed to sharing this land acknowledgement and following up with other actions to educate and be respectful. Thank you. Okay. Next, I'd like to thank our BirdFest sponsors. There's the lands of the Shinpesquawshu and other natives of the area. And our BirdFest sponsors, we got the National North Central Washington Audubon Society, KOA Holiday, Ludwig's Restaurant, Sleeping Lady Mountain Resort, the Munchin House, South Restaurant, Syndicate Smith, the Leavenworth Outdoor Center, and Icicle Brewing. Next, it's only because of all of these sponsors and all of the volunteers who worked that we can do BirdFest. So what's great is now we are going to talk about we're going to talk about WRI first. Sorry. WRI is here to connect people, communities in the natural world. And we do that through educational events like this for adults. We also do that through our traveling naturalist program that takes educators into the classroom and kids out of the classroom. So we take our naturalists who will run field trips for these students, K to 8th grade, to their classrooms and teach hands-on science. And we take those kids to our campus and to campuses nearby where those schools are to teach them about nature. Other things we do, Red Barn events, similar to this one, a lot of Wednesdays most months. So you can find events like that and other ways to connect with WRI on our website. So please sign up if you get a chance. You get a great email from Randy. All right. If you're looking for more to do this BirdFest weekend, we still have a few events available. Do I have my schedule up here, Randy? Huh? It's a few slides away. Oh, here it is. Nope. Sorry. Yeah. So if you're here and you don't know what you're going to do tomorrow morning, we still have a few spots left. Some great trips there, leaving very early in the morning. So if you want to make that happen, decide now. You can sign up online. Randy, is that the right thing to do? Yes. Yeah, still sign up online. If you want to do some more stuff, there's some awesome trips there. Great. Now, before we dive into the presentation, which is going to be a great one, we'd like to take a moment to recognize our Founders Awards. Janet, will you come up here? Where are you, Janet? Janet. There she is. Thank you for coming up. Not only is Janet a Founders Award award winner, but also she's, would you call yourself a nestling surrogate mother? Yeah. What would you call yourself right now? Hot mess. No, hot mess with very young chicks.
I'm with chicks.
She is with chicks. Literally. I'll let you explain that if you'd like. There you go. I don't even have to say anything more, but look at that.
Somebody in Wenatchee found them in their driveway. What are they? I don't know. They might be robins, they might be starlings. So anyway, I'm trying to keep them alive because there are no rescues on the east side until you get to WSU. You have to, and so I'm not running them over to Starvey right now or Pause or whoever. So.
Wow. Awesome. I mean, what else do we need to say? I'm going to say some more things about Janet, but wow. Janet, let's give her a hand right now. Woo! Woo! All right, a little more. Janet.
Yes, don't hug.
No hugging Janet. Janet started volunteering for BirdFest before it existed and continuously served over the years. In January 2003, she helped inform the steering committee's work, resulting in the multifaceted design of BirdFest, still in place today. In the early years, BirdFest was supported and staffed by the U.S. Forest Service. As a wildlife crew employee, Janet checked out trip locations, designed itineraries, drove participants, and led groups as a bird guide. Janet is a legendary trip leader, well known among festival goers for her birding by ear boot camp and for her nighttime owl prowls. Please join me in thanking Janet for her years of volunteer support. Thank you, Janet. Yes, thank you.
Whoever comes. It's always like I wanted to be a teacher, but I don't like kids, so I love love teaching people who were here to learn. So it's fun.
All right, next up is Gail. Gail Roberts. Gail. Where's Gail? He's birding? She's birding? Okay, not here. Well, Gail is our other recipient of the Founders Award winner in the professional category. She served as a key architect for 6 festivals as the solo staff organizer when the festival launched. Gail worked in her capacity as a U.S. Forest Service wildlife crew employee, planning and leading trips. Later, she was hired as the festival coordinator and made the event a huge success. She coordinated trips, leaders, and transportation, wrangled volunteers, recruited sponsors, implemented publicity, took registration information, and more, and she knows how to sneak out of being honored. That's an important role.
She did say she has an elderly dog, and if she wasn't here tonight, because she has a dog near death.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, thank you, Gail, for all of your work. She's also collaborated with local artists who created a bird art walk map and tour taught bird-themed art classes to high school student artists, designed t-shirts, hung shows of student artwork. Through her professional work, Gail advocated for birding within Chelan County's unique habitats. Gail Roberts laid the foundation to making a sustainable and long-lived Leavenworth Spring Bird Fest. So it's thanks to work from folks like her that we get to have this such a robust festival as it is today. So thank you, Gail. All right, Dan Stevens. Dan's here in the front. Stand up, Dan, please. There he is in the flesh. There's John. Here comes Dan. There's Dan. There's Dan. Yay. Come over. Yeah, you got to come over here and be in the
Video.
video. Thanks. Thanks, Jeremy. Dan Stevens has made considerable contributions to Birdfest. For 21 years, Dan has designed and led Birdfest trips to explore Douglas County's shrub steppe habitat. Recently, Dan has invited pre-festival participants to join his Wenatchee Valley College ornithology students on a class field trip. Dan is a tenured biology professor at WVC and is curator of the college's bird study skin collection. I think we had a few of those in our possession, but we got them back. Yeah. Oh, good. Dan started building this collection in the early 1990s, which currently contains 480 bird study skins, including 160 different species of birds. More than 200 community members, ornithologists, students, colleagues, and friends have contributed their time to collect, prepare, and maintain the bird skins. This year, he hosted the first ever open house showcasing the entire collection. Please help us thank Dan for all of your support. Thank you very much, Dan.
It's just been a real pleasure to be part of the Birdfest all these years, and a real honor to work with all these wonderful naturalists and with all you come, and it just makes me happy.
Yay. Thanks, Dan. All right. What you've all been waiting for. Our keynote speaker, Dr. John Marzluff. There he is over there. John is a James W. Ridgway Professor of Wildlife Science at the University of Washington. His current research focuses on the interactions of ravens and wolves in Yellowstone. He teaches ornithology, governance, and conservation of rare species, field research in Yellowstone, and natural and cultural history of Costa Rica. I wish I were in college right now. That sounds great. Dr. Marzluff has written 6 books and edited several others. His books are available for purchase this evening in the back or at A Book for All Seasons. He has mentored over 40 grad students, authored 170 scientific papers on various aspects of bird behavior and wildlife management. Help us welcome Dr. John Marzluff to the floor. Thank you. Comment. Oh, one more thing. Jeremy says, in order to have Q&A work for the people who are not here, we need to give Jeremy a chance to turn on the audience mics for questions and answers. So we're going to hold questions for a grouping whenever John wants them to be happening, but we just need to have them announced and not spontaneously erupt. Okay? Great. Take it away.
Questions. You didn't say I had to answer questions.
No, we'll make it up.
Thank you very much for coming out tonight and for the opportunity to talk to you all about some research that we're currently doing. It does include most work done in Yellowstone, so not directly right here, but I think the information we're learning there about ravens and wolves is very relevant to the situation here, as wolves are coming back to our part of the world. And we certainly have lots of ravens that are challenging to us in many ways. And I'll hit upon some of those things tonight. This graph, I will have some graphs, there'll be numbers tonight. So if you've had 2 glasses of wine, just bear with me. But we are seeing this sort of a trend in the number of ravens in Washington, across the Western US. This graph is from Montana, but the same exponential increase in the last 30, 40 years, depending on where you're at, is very characteristic of their population size. This is not an endangered species. This is a species that is absolutely keyed into the world as it is today and as it's changed, and is able to exploit that world and use it to its own advantage. This thing is not working now. Not only have these birds increased in abundance, but they've influenced our culture dramatically. This illustration that Tony Angel did, Tony and I have done several works together on ravens and crows, and he drew this image to show the trajectory of how these birds, crows and ravens around the world, have influenced human culture. So we were hearing about some of the native peoples here just a bit ago. Those peoples were influenced greatly by ravens as creators, as motivators, as spiritual icons. If we move up to Alaska, you're either, as a native person, you're either an eagle or a raven. And of course, you were better off if you were a raven, no doubt. But they have been extremely influential here in the Pacific Northwest. But this influence has carried on around the world. In Asia, corvids in general were recognized for their social behaviors and their interesting pair bonding and familial ties, and that was celebrated by many Asian artists. In Europe, they are viewed as informers of the gods that were had there. If you're in Norway, for example, the Odin was informed daily by his two ravens that would go out and check out the world and come back and tell him what was going on, what he needed to pay attention to. So these birds were very important in how we viewed the world, how we gathered information about that world and put it to use. They also influenced things like our dance, our language, not only our religions and beliefs here, but for example, if you think about the various ways crows and ravens are used in the English language, you might use ravenous, for example, if you're hungry. As you get older, you might get crow's feet on your face, and many other ways that these animals have influenced our language and our views today. And this has continued to the present. Actually, as their numbers have increased, they've been seen as perhaps a harbinger of bad things to come. I don't know how many of you, I'm sure you guys all pay attention to bird calls in movies and TV shows. It drives me crazy when it's the wrong bird, you know, in the wrong habitat. But you know, if you hear a crow or a raven anywhere, something bad's going to happen probably in the next few minutes in that show. So they've gotten a bad rap in that way because of their association as scavengers. Their evolution is also quite interesting. So I want to start off with a little bit of background about the birds for you, and then we'll get into some more of the particular new research. But these birds evolved in the northern hemisphere. Ravens, they started off with ancestors in Africa, but then spread across the northern hemisphere, and Beringia, the connection between Alaska and the Far East and Russian East, has been very important to the evolution, not only of ravens, but lots of the species we have here that were isolated either into the New World or able to occupy the New World from Old World roots several million years ago or even earlier. And ravens are an example of that. So as that land mass waxed and waned with glaciation, so when glaciers were prominent, sea levels drop, the land mass is more evident and animals live on it, depending on what habitat was there. And a couple of million years ago, it was steppe habitat, which was suitable for raven occupation. And ravens basically were able to colonize the New World about 2 million years ago because of that connection. They were in the Old World. Most of the birds we have here evolved in the Old World and came across Beringia to populate the New World. Some came up through South America, flycatchers in particular, but most, including ravens, most of our passerines came across Beringia. Ravens, as I said, were diverging in Africa 4 or so million years ago. They then were in the Old World a couple of million years ago, and that's when they first came across through Beringia into the New World. So we had ravens in North America and in Europe 2 million years ago, and then they were separated because of warming climates, increasing sea levels, and separation of those parts of the world in the Northern Hemisphere. And during that 2 million years, they were evolving some differences, just random differences in their DNA. In the Old World, they gave rise to another raven, the Canary Island raven, a new species there, which exists still today with common ravens. And in our part of the world, they gave rise to the Chihuahuan raven in the Southwest, which maybe some of you have seen in Arizona, New Mexico, even Oklahoma, places like that. Very different bird, very different behavior, flocking species, sounds different, a little bit smaller than our ravens here. But that was going on a couple million years ago. And then the connection between Beringia, the connection of Beringia between Old and New Worlds happened again about 25 to 40,000 years ago. It was on and off several times. But during this time, ravens again from the Old World colonized the New World. There was already ravens here, right, that had come over a couple million years ago. Now these newcomers come over again, and the genetic differences that were accruing between Old and New World has now been homogenized with these new recruits that have come over. So we had a speciation process occurring. And in fact, if you look at the genetics, we can tell the birds that were in that first wave of colonization a couple million years ago, they are genetically very distinct from those that came across most recently or those that occur today in Europe. They are actually more genetically distinct than the Chihuahuan raven and the common raven is today. So we thought that might be a new species, but in fact, it's not because of this increasing flow of genes from the Old World to the New World during this period, when not only ravens came across, but wolves and people came across. And I think these three species, wolves, people, and ravens, have been co-evolving for millions of years, not only in Europe, but then now in the New World as they came together. And they've been interacting as competitors, as scavengers for one another, as perhaps even emissaries to show one another where food resources were. So people following ravens, people following wolves, scavenging from them, and all vice versa. But the three of us have had a tight coevolutionary history from Neanderthals to Homo sapiens with ravens and wolves throughout our history, especially here in the New World. And that's what's intrigued me about what was going on in Yellowstone, because there we now have that full sequence. We have people, we've had ravens, people and ravens together there for 25,000 years. We lost the wolves for quite a period of time, and now they're back. And how many of you have been to Yellowstone and seen wolves and ravens interacting there? Several of you, yeah. It's a great scene now to be able to see basically the Pleistocene reenacting in part. I mean, we don't have ground sloths and all the other great big animals that didn't make it, perhaps in part because they didn't get along well with us, like wolves and ravens have been able to do. But we have those three components. And so we started a new research project there. I'll introduce some of my colleagues in a second, but just for funding purposes, University of Washington, National Geographic Society, and Max Planck Institute have funded the work I'm going to tell you about. And our intention was to catch and tag as many ravens as we could, and then follow their movements and associate that with wolves and pumas and other carnivores that were also being tracked in this area. So a little bit about the biology of these birds first, and then I'll go into a little bit about the results we're getting from our tracking and co-association with wolf and human studies. So first off, these animals form lifelong mates. Here's a pair of ravens preening one another. You've undoubtedly seen crows or ravens doing this around town or in the country. And when you see that, that's usually a mated pair. It could be a pair forming, but usually a mated pair. They spend a lot of time with each other, grooming one another, caring for one another, so that they both remain healthy and are able to reproduce. But there's more than just pairs of ravens out there. There's a lot of ravens that we call vagrant non-breeders. And these are individuals that don't have a territory. They might have a good friend or two, but they don't have a mate, and they move around wildly over the landscape. And they go into places where food pops up. Maybe it's a dump here, maybe it's a carcass here, maybe it's a farmland, whatever. They move around wherever food resources are good. They'll stay a while and then move to another place. They don't form a permanent structure in a flock by any means, because the membership is always turning over and moving and changing. So these animals have a very different lifestyle than do the adults that are territorial. These animals have a great diversity of vocalizations. I'm sure all of you who live in Raven country hear weird things. And usually I always tell people, if you hear something and you don't know what it is, it's either a Steller's jay or a raven. And they make all kinds of noises. And hopefully this will play again for you guys, but they do things like this courtship knocking, which you might hear, just females typically doing that call. They'll defend their territories with other stronger sounding calls like this. You might hear birds that are hungry, that are yelling, and these will be very annoying. In the spring, this is still the territorial calls. So these very resonant, far-reaching calls basically advertise, hey, it's my space, stay out of it. That call you'll hear starting in a few weeks as young birds get out of the nest, and you might have 4 of these in your yard, and you'll be tired of this call rather quickly. But this is a sign that these birds give that they're hungry. They see food that they cannot get to. We can experimentally turn it on and off by doing that. And ravens are the common raven's the largest songbird in the world. And because of that, they have the ability to learn and reproduce many different sounds. And as you all know, some birds learn at a short period of time in their life, others throughout their lifespan. And ravens learn throughout their lifespan. And if they're raised with people, they can learn to talk in various languages. So I'll play you a quick clip here just for fun that is of a raven answering questions from its owner, Mrs. Hurlbut. So you will hear her ask the raven questions, and the raven will answer in a voice that sounds a lot like hers.
What's your name?
That's the raven, Edgar.
Well, maybe you know about Edgar Allan Poe. According to him, what is the raven supposed to say?
That's for the poet. They can even have an attitude.
What would you call a bird that did that?
So if you hear something in the woods that you're not familiar with, maybe somebody telling you to do something, look up. It's probably a raven. A little bit about their behavior around food, because most of what we study is associated with their finding food and how they communicate about it and use it. And in Maine, Colleen and I with Bernd Heinrich discovered that ravens there basically share information at their nighttime roosts about where food is located. And the foods that they are sharing information about are things like a dead moose. There weren't big carnivores there. They're not wolves. There were some coyotes. But when a pair of ravens finds a dead moose, like in the top panel there, they're quiet about it. They like to keep that secret. They would rather have that moose for the whole winter and eat it throughout the season and not have to get any other food. So they're quiet, they're eating, they're caching the food around. And then a young bird, one of these vagrants, comes by and finds it. And when they find it, they try to get in and eat. They can't eat in the presence of that territorial pair because they're dominant and they're aggressive and they're defensive. And the young birds come in and they start to eat and they're chased and they're attacked and they whine and they cry and they give those yelling calls that I played, and they give begging calls to try to suppress the aggression from the adults. And that commotion attracts other birds to the area. They're not doing it purposefully. They're doing it to try to get the adults to quit attacking them. But the side effect is that there's a lot of noise that's advertising the location of some food that ravens are trying to get to. And so other ravens come into that. Eventually, some will go back to the nighttime roost, and they roost in groups of 100 or thousands of individuals in some places. And then if you're a bird in a roost and you don't know where food is that next day, it's a pretty simple task. You just wait, sit back, and the first birds that leave from that roost that morning are going to go directly to the food, and you just wait back and follow. And so they can passively learn about new resources by tracking their roost mates at the roost. So it's not a purposeful, hey, there's food over here, let's go there tomorrow. But if you know where to go, or you know where there's food, you go. And if you don't, you wait and follow. And it works very well. And it works in a reciprocal way, so that if you find food one day and behave like that, then the next time when you don't find food, your roost mates behave like that, you can follow them and get food that way. We were interested in a place with carnivores if this same sort of thing would happen, and in a place that's more open. You're kind of intermediate here, not thick forest in lots of places, but ponderosa pines more open. And then you've got shrub steppe areas and riparian areas that that ravens might be able to see resources in and not have to rely upon somebody else informing them basically of where it is. And in Yellowstone, the ravens there are dealing with this. This is what happens to an elk calf after wolves have captured and eaten it, and there's an eagle on it already, and there might be coyotes coming in, there might be other eagles coming in, goldens and balds, and basically that food is consumed within a very short period of time, a day or two or three at the most, for most of the kills that are made there. So in that sort of environment, you don't really need, it doesn't do you any good to go back to the roost because the next morning there isn't much to go back to. So there might be some other ways that they're finding food. Plus, there's lots of other resources around in our world now. Ravens, of course, love to go to garbage dumps and forage on the garbage, whether it's in cans or in the back of somebody's truck. They will beg directly from tourists that are in areas, and they're like lost puppies. They come up to you and look forlorn in your eyes, and you can't resist but giving them a little bit of food. And then there are other most favorite place to feed around humans, in addition to agriculture, is our wastewater treatment plants. And I understand some of you were at a wastewater treatment plant today. Birding, always best place to go for birding. And in this case, what ravens are doing is they're skimming the fat off of the wastewater as it's being processed. And it blows to one side usually, and they just skim the fat. And it's a super energy-rich source of food. There's not much competition for it. As you can see, lots of birds crowded in, not fighting for it because each little globule is a individually procured piece. All right, so my collaborators in this study are primarily Matthias Loretto. Matthias is a scientist in Germany. He's an Austrian and has studied ravens since he was about 8 years old. And he's enamored with the bird much as I was. And he got funding to allow us to be able to purchase 60 high-tech radio tags that we were able to put on our birds to allow us to follow them around and really start to understand how they use their resources. And in addition, Doug Smith and Dan Staler are in charge of the carnivore projects in Yellowstone, and their animals are tagged, and we collaborate on sharing information about our animals. And then Lauren Walker and several of my undergrads, Cameron Ho and Georgia Coleman, have participated in this research to allow us to learn what's going on with these birds. We catch our birds using a net launcher, and we attract them to foods either that we put out or the carnivores have put out in the park. And when they come to one of these food resources, you'll see here in a second, hopefully, a little bit of food they're feeding on that wolves drug out of a pond. And our gun is in the sage here. When they're in the right place, we can fire it remotely and hopefully catch some like we were lucky enough to do there. Then we put these radio tags on, which how many of you have done telemetry at some point? One. It used to be basically you would get a, tick, 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 and you'd home in on this signal. And you basically were limited to what you could get data-wise by whether you could get to where that signal was coming from. And oftentimes it was like way over there or way up that mountain or whatever, and you couldn't get much data. We were lucky on the Olympic Peninsula studying ravens to get 30 locations a year on one of our birds. We have 750,000 locations now on the birds we've tagged with these tags. These tags collect the information, high quality GPS locations. They store them on the tag. They are powered by solar recharging batteries. They connect to the cell network and upload the data to the cell network. And they basically text us their location and where they've been, for the last couple of weeks or whatever it is since we've seen them last. So we get a tremendous amount of information from these birds now with these tags they carry. That was all going great until they turned off the 3G network, which our tags were working on. So we got about 3 years of really good data. We're still getting a lot of data, but we have to get it more manually now. So we can also collect the locations that are stored on the tags with handheld GPS units or handheld receivers that contact the tag and download the data. But it was really, the new tags and the things we will learn in the next decades about the movements of animals is really unlimited with the ability to keep track of them in these ways. So what do these birds do? What do they eat after we tag them? There are two basic sorts of foods they eat. things that we provide, anthropogenic foods up there in the top, and natural foods over on the right. And in the summertime, the use of anthropogenic foods is pretty low, and it's much higher in the winter. The blue bar there is higher than the orange bar. The opposite's true for natural foods. Natural foods are used mostly in the summer and much less in the winter in our study. And this is based on about 60 birds that we tagged and followed for a couple of years. And in terms of the anthropogenic foods that they feed upon, mostly in the winter again, gut piles, there's a big use of hunter gut piles. These are primarily elk or deer that are killed outside of Yellowstone Park, and the birds go and eat. They also eat some roadkill, some agricultural products. They eat that waste, whether it's trash or whether it's fat at the sewage treatment plants during the winter primarily. And in the summer, most of the food that they eat are what we call natural dispersed foods. And that's a fancy word for insects and other sorts of invertebrates. And there are two main ways or three main ways they get these, and they really seem to track the blooms of different invertebrates throughout the park. So it's sometimes salmon flies emerge along the rivers there, and the ravens line up literally like the people that are fishing for fish that are also eating all those salmon flies. They line up on the river and they're hawking these big juicy stoneflies. And then there are insects that are most common at high elevation late in the summer. Things like army cutworm moths that grizzly bears go up and eat. The ravens are up there eating those as well. But the most common source of food for the bulk of the winter are insects that are in the bison droppings, the bison patties. And basically, these ravens walk around and they flip over bison patties, and they get all the invertebrates that are under those. They rip them apart, and they get all the fly larvae that are in there. And of course, this led to us having to go and flip patties and see what was under those and tear up bison crap and to see what was in those. And basically within a given patty, if you hit it at the right time, you get a handful of maggots that are a great resource for insectivorous animal to eat, like these ravens. So they are very diverse in what they eat, and they're very diverse in where they get it. So here is the map. The first solid green in the middle is the outline of Yellowstone. The larger green around it is what we call the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So the watershed basically, and the food shed that serves the animals that use the park for part of the year. Our ravens are going all over this area. They are using different things in different places. In the top part of the park there, you see a lot of red dots. And those red dots are basically carcasses of wolves and other carnivores that these animals are utilizing primarily in the northern range of large elk herd that lives in the park, in the Lamar Valley, for those of you who have been in that part of the park. And as you get outside of the park, you see blue triangles and teal colors. The teal colors are those insect blooms that they hit at different places. The blue triangles are agricultural foods that they hit, whether it's a ranch that might have some dead calves, or whether there's crops there that they're utilizing as well. So the point of this slide is that they're all over the place and eating a lot of different things across this landscape. And it's a little different if you are a breeder versus a non-breeder. So breeders are constrained in where they can go because they've got to deal with these hungry kids and feed them as they're raising them in the nest. And they are kind of tied to that nest area for about a month of incubation, another month to 4 to 5 weeks of feeding nestlings, and then eventually feeding individuals after they fledge from the nest. And so what we see, and it's illustrated here, all these purple dots are the locations of one individual every half hour for this period of the summer. And she basically spent all of her time within 5 miles of her nest at Mud Volcano is where her nest was. But that bird didn't venture far because she was either taking care of incubating eggs or feeding those chicks, and then feeding the fledglings when they got out of the nest, which lasts for about a month. And these young are persistent. They follow their parents around, and the parents have to provide for them. And they can't fly very well at that point. So again, they just don't go very far. So pretty small range in the summer. But soon as this kid is kicked out of the territory, which after about a month they are, the parents don't tolerate them anymore. And then the parents start to wander widely. And this was one of the first surprises we got. We figured non-breeders would travel a long way. We had no idea that breeding birds like this bird, again, whose territory was right here, and she spent all of her time here for 6 months. Now she starts flying 50 to 70 miles every day, one way and back and forth. So she flies up north, comes back to her territory at night to roost, flies back up north, comes back. Sometimes she goes over to the west. And what she's doing is she's exploiting hunters. All of her, these are her blue dots of her locations, and she concentrates her activity in this part of the area between just outside the northern part of the park, where elk hunting is super common. And she starts doing that right when elk season starts in mid-October. She's flying up there every day, eating gut piles, then flying back home, roost at night to make sure nobody gets her territory, and goes back. And there's also, if she doesn't happen to find a gut pile that day, she can go over to the wastewater treatment plant, which is there, or some trash receptacles that are the upper circle in that diagram. So that was unexpected, that kind of traveling and commuting especially. And you wonder energetically, how does that work out? I mean, that's a pretty decent flight every day. They fly about 30 miles an hour. So she's basically spending 2 to 3 hours every day flying just to go up and then eat these elk guts. And it's a profitable strategy. She was able to breed successfully during the years doing that. And all of our territorial birds do that. Young birds disperse widely, and this we expected. We didn't know exactly how they would go, but this bird I tagged as a juvenile in the park in the Lamar Valley. And during his first 6 months of life, he traveled about 700 kilometers up to an area south of Calgary. And this bird, all along the way, the yellow dots there and the red dots are use of anthropogenic resources, either foods, the yellow, or the red dots are roosting locations on power lines. So this bird is taking advantage of the foods we have put out on the landscape, basically, the way we've modified the landscape for feeding and for spending the night in safety up on these high power line poles in an area that is otherwise often shrub steppe, where ravens wouldn't be able to nest in a very safe position. So our modification of the landscape has facilitated this kind of widespread dispersal as well. And even some of the non-breeders, they're not all that young. Some of these birds in Europe are 15 or 16 years old, and they still haven't gotten a territory and ascended the dominance hierarchy enough to defend it and get a mate. And some of our older birds, one of them here in particular, covered the whole area that's outlined in red. He seems to have settled down now. I'm hoping maybe he has a nest this year. But he's basically covered an area that's 6,500 square miles over 1 year during his traveling. And just, going from hotspot of food to the next or potential territory to the next, and just basically learning, I think, in a very detailed way, this whole lay of land. For those of you who know this area, these are the Tetons, and Yellowstone's way up at the top of that. So he's covering all of that area of Wyoming and into Montana. And I think knows what's where and how to use that. So just to summarize those movement data, we have territorial birds in the summer that don't move very far, maybe 5 to 10 kilometers on a day. What's plotted here is how far they might move in maximum on one given day. So maybe less than 10 kilometers on average in the summer, but in the winter, and then for non-breeders, they all cover about 20 to 30 kilometers each day, regardless of what they're doing. And some days they might stay, for a few days in a row at a place and not move much, but other days they might move 100 or more miles to go to something else. So what's interesting to me is the individual strategies that these birds have. They don't all do the same thing. And we know some of this is their age, right? Young birds do one thing, adults can do something else. They have different constraints, different needs, and they do that. But there's also probably a lot else going on with respect to why certain individuals do certain sorts of behaviors more than others. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of those different strategies we've seen. And I'll start off with a graph that just focus on the colors. Each of the rows here is an individual tagged bird, and the proportion of the different colors is their use of different resources. So for example, the use of natural dispersed insects is the teal color. And you can see this bird down here, almost all of its diet is that. This bird basically just walks around and flips bison patties all year and gets food by doing that and is able to be quite successful. Up on the top with the red, those are birds that are using mostly human waste. So there are some that just sit at the dump all day, every day, and get what they can there. And that strategy works for them. And then there's birds in between. The ones with a lot of purple in the middle there, those are ones that are really specialized on wolves and winter kill and other sorts of things. Much more interesting, perhaps, than eating, bison waste or human waste. But there's a great variety. There's a gradient there of how individuals are using these different foods. So let's talk about some of these first. Let's talk about those that use wolves more and how they use wolves. This is really what motivated our study. We had hoped that these animals had a very tight relationship with one another. And in fact, there were observations by eminent ecologists, some of which I have up here for you, that suggest that these birds and these mammals, wolves and ravens, have really a symbiotic relationship, like a hummingbird and a flower. They've co-evolved together. They both benefit from this association. Meach, who's the eminent studier of wolves, he basically suggested that there were some ravens on Isle Royale that he didn't think could exist without wolves. My guess is that some of those birds were flying 100 miles to feed on human resources around there, but you don't know it when you're just watching the wolves. All you see is ravens with wolves. Heinrich and Doug and Dan in Yellowstone observed cases where it looked like the ravens might be indicating to the wolves that there was an injured animal that they could maybe prey upon. So maybe the ravens were indicating something for the wolves. When the wolves make a kill, the ravens would benefit by being able to eat that. And in fact, as I said, if you look at wolves, which Dan Staler did in Yellowstone for his thesis, what you see is that there are almost always ravens around wolves. So the blue arrow on top shows that of all sightings of wolves during the first few years after their reintroduction, 87% of the time there was a raven there. And 100% of the time when ravens were foraging, wolves were foraging, there was a raven there. In contrast, they don't care much about coyotes, and they don't care much about elk, as you might expect. Well, when we tagged our birds, now our focus is not on watching wolves and seeing are there ravens there, but now let's watch a particular raven and say, do they follow wolves? And what we found is that about half, not quite half of the birds that we had tagged had basically been at one of the wolf kills that the wolf biologists knew about. So we had many cases where there was 1 or 2 or 3 of our tagged birds at a wolf kill, a lot of cases where there were none, and a few cases where there was up to a dozen of our tagged birds at one of their wolf kills. Not all of them, but a lot. And in fact, over a 3-year period now, what we can say is that almost all 59 of the 69 tagged ravens have visited at least a wolf kill or a puma kill at least once. And there are some birds that don't seem to do it very often at all. And there are some that seem to do it quite a lot. Maybe those ones that were basically there 5 or more times, we suggest are kind of addicted to wolves. And they basically are typically birds that are territorial in the places where wolves are most frequent. So they have the opportunity to do that. We had one male who visited 54 different wolf kills during the period we were tracking him. And so this was the most addicted animal that we had to wolves, most addicted raven to wolves. And this crazy looking graph shows that he still wasn't that keen on being with wolves all the time. What's shown down here is basically from January 2020, just chronological order, to January 2022, and the distance between that animal, that raven, and any wolf that was radio tagged in the park. And the red line indicates 500 meters, which we assume is close enough that the raven knew the wolves were there, and we'll call that associated. It's kind of a conservative estimate to say they were associated with one another within 500 meters. And all these dots below the red line are times when the raven and the wolf were really close. And those that are above the red line are when they're really far apart. And what you see is that it bounces around a lot. Sometimes they're close, then they go far away, then they're close and then far away. They're not just always, there's not a big string of close observations in a row. There's often a string of far observations where they're way away from any wolves. And then they'll come back and check in on the wolves, and then they'll go away and then they'll come back. And the other thing that's kind of cool to see here is that the colors are the different packs of wolves that are tagged. And so you see that it's mostly this raven with the green colored pack, which is the Junction Butte pack, which is one of the most visible packs that we've had in the park. So there's some preference of this animal, who's a vagrant, not a territorial bird, to be with that pack of wolves. But sometimes he's with the blue pack, sometimes he's with the red pack over here. So he moves around too. He's not focused in on one individual wolf or one pack. He doesn't just sit and follow that pack around waiting for them to kill. He goes away, does his thing, comes back, checks on them, and gets a meal. So I would not say that as a very tight symbiotic association when you look at it from the raven's perspective. Territorial birds also exploit wolves, and they exploit ones that are nearby. And this is just an example of, again, all the pink dots there are locations of one of our tagged territorial birds in the Lamar Valley. She has a nest up there where that cluster of points is. And then each of these yellow balloons is a place where wolves had made a kill. And the bigger dots, like this blue one, and the pink and the reddish ones, those are locations of tagged wolves. And so what you see on the yellow balloons, like this one, there's a lot of wolves there, they're at a kill, and the raven's there with them. Then she goes over to that kill, then that one, and she's hitting all the kills that are around her. But she may only be there for a day or two. Then she's back in her territory doing something else, maybe begging from tourists on the highway that's right there. So she's playing lots of different resources. Sometimes she does follow wolves. So this was really the only example we had of this individual female. She starts up here. This line that comes down to the 2 points here, she's flown across the Lamar Valley. The wolves are, again, these bigger circles. She meets up with one of the wolves there. There's no food there. The wolves are all moving this way, and she flies along with them and joins them in this gully where they are presumably, we don't know that there was a kill there, but their behavior of being all in a cluster for the whole day, and the raven being there with them the whole day, suggests that she followed them to some food source there. Either they made a kill or they scavenged something that they had killed before, and she joined them. Then she goes back to her territory and begs from tourists or whatever else she needs to do. And if we look at her plot through time of the distance from that Junction Butte pack again, which is now in yellow on this diagram, you again see there are some times like here where she's close to them a lot. That's probably where she was hitting all those different kills that I just showed. But then she goes away and actually joins in with another pack for a little while that happens to come into the valley, the green pack there. And then she comes back to the Junction Buttes and back and forth. So again, exploitation of that pack, but not close association, I would say. It's convenient for her to get them there. And if we look at how ravens utilize a kill over time, you see a pattern somewhat like this, which can help us understand. The other question we had to start was, did these animals, do they use nighttime roosts to tell one another, basically, even if it's indirectly, where food is? And we don't think they do that either there. It's a very different system than we saw in Maine. And what we have here is early on this first day, I was watching the wolf pack, and there was one raven with the wolves at that time. So again, like if you watch wolves, you see ravens. But then there were 4 right when they made a kill. They flushed a bull elk out of the timber, killed it, 4 ravens there. And right away during the next several hours, the number of ravens that accumulated at that kill site was up to 15 different ravens, at least. Then as night approached, the ravens went home to their roost. The next morning they came back, there was 23 of them early. So maybe some were attracted from the roost like we saw in Maine in response to this kill. These birds that had been there the first day didn't get to eat much because there was 12 wolves eating the elk that day and not much room for ravens to get in. The wolves chase and defend their kill from the ravens. And then their numbers build throughout the day. And basically from there on out, there doesn't seem to be any exchange at the roost. So if you go from the second day to the third day, you're actually losing the number of ravens there again, because most of the food's consumed. So it takes a little longer than we thought for this to happen. So there might be some opportunity the first day or so for recruitment from the roost, but for the most part, it's individuals finding the food during the day, either hearing all the commotion there or smelling it or somehow randomly happening upon it. Another situation that is really common and that we had several of our radio tag birds at is that a kill is made at night. And so in the morning, all of a sudden, there's this food on the landscape for ravens to utilize. And again, what we see first thing in the morning is just one or two birds there. And I'll show you in a second, those are the territorial birds that happen to be nearby. Then the numbers increased dramatically during the day. And in this case, there were up to 33 ravens that within about, well, by about 2 in the afternoon. And from then on, we really didn't get more than that at the kill. So everything happened during the day, not from one night to the next morning that would imply the use of a roost. So in this case, we think, again, most of the information is parasitized. It's out there as a signal. Lots of commotion, sounds, sights, cars that are accumulating there to watch this, this spectacle. And there's lots of information out there that allow these birds to home in on a new food source. And then they eat it and the numbers dwindle away. Well, let's look at more detail at what was going on at that kill with respect to 4 of our tagged birds. So 2 of them down here in purple and red are territorial males that live very close to where that wolf kill was made. And then there was a non-breeding bird in Bozeman and another non-breeding bird in yellow over here up by Billings, each about 100 miles away from that kill site. So the first day the kill's made, the territorial birds get right in on the kill. Up there, the W is where the kill is, and the red and purple birds are there within the first half of the first morning after the kill was discovered. Remember, this one was made at night. So then those territorial birds are right there. The next day, the bird from Bozeman decides to fly 140 miles, pretty much straight line, past the kill, then back to it, feed there for that day, and then go back home. And the following day, the bird from Billings flies 100 miles straight line over the highest peaks in Montana that are right here. And each of those points is a half an hour apart. It's flying 30 miles an hour right into the kill. So if you can explain to me how that bird knew 100 miles away that there was a wolf kill at that spot, I'd like to hear that explanation. We don't have a clue, but I think it has a lot to do with a pattern of searching, not so much knowing what was going on, but just knowing that, hey, this is a pretty good area to go look for wolf kills in that part of the region. And I'll eat at the dump in Billings for a while till I'm satisfied or that I've built up enough resources to be able to take a risky flight in and find a kill. And in fact, if we look at that bird's points over the whole winter, there's a lot of times where it made that flight. So this isn't the only time. All of that circle is several different flights over the course of the winter that bird came into this area from the dump up in Billings or agricultural lands nearby. Sometimes it finds a kill, sometimes it keeps going to Gardner and forages at the dump there. But I think this is a strategy to go in and look for food or to look for other ravens, which is also super important. So getting something to eat is important for these birds, but getting around other ravens to display, to challenge, to potentially get a territory or a mate is also super important for them. And if you notice on this figure or this image, there's a dead bison, and there are a few ravens there that are eating the food. But over half of the birds in this picture are displaying to one another. They're not eating. They can get a little food, but they're mostly interested in showing off to one another that, hey, I'm dominant here, or I've got a mate, or I need a mate, or I'm hoping to get a territory here. That's what most of the activity is around these kills. They sneak in and get a little bit of food, but mostly they're showing off to one another. And this is basically like, I think Byrne used the term, a traveling disco. And they're in there dancing and showing off to one another and getting a lot of other benefit out of flying in and taking that risky flight in to find a wolf kill, because they can have this kind of a party when they get there as opposed to just a meal. If they don't find it, they can go on and eat garbage in, the other end of the park. But if they do, they get to participate in this sort of a social display. Right. So do wolves get anything out of this? Ravens clearly do. They get either social activity or they get food or both. But what about wolves? Well, we were able to get some insight into some of the cases where it appears that wolves might follow ravens to a new food source. And so in these, I'll show you several maps here in a row that just are chronological of this setting. And what you have again are individual wolves that are tagged here, these dots. You've got ravens that are now the yellow balloons. And those yellow balloons means there's a group of ravens there that have been there for several days. We don't know what they're doing. We just know they're concentrated at that spot. And I would put a lot of money on the fact that they're probably eating a dead bison that died over the winter or some big animal that died and has held them there for a while. In this situation, the red dots are right there with the raven group. And basically those red dots were there at the same time or before the ravens accumulated. And that basically looks like a wolf kill. Wolves made a kill, the ravens then accumulated there. In this case, at 8:50, there are a group of ravens and no wolves, but there are some tagged wolves nearby. So we can watch what those wolves do. And the next day, they get closer to the kill. They're still not right at it or whatever the ravens are eating there. The next day, the third day, they get on that food and stay there for the following day with the group of ravens, and then they go away. And so that looks to us like they've been attracted maybe by the raven commotion. Again, 30 ravens are pretty noisy around food. They're flying, they're chasing, they're calling. And maybe the wolves did indeed learn something about this new food source that they didn't know about. They could have also smelled it on their own. Maybe they even killed it earlier and were away when we saw ravens there and then they come back. We don't know exactly. But we have a few cases like this. I think we found 17 instances like that over the first year and a half. And even with those situations, we estimate that the benefit to ravens of finding wolf kills is 6 times greater than the benefit to wolves of finding something ravens are scavenging. Okay, so it's still a very asymmetrical, if you want to call it symbiotic, I would say asymmetrical relationship in which both species are using one another, ravens really using wolves and wolves occasionally using ravens. They also, sometimes ravens are at cougar kills. It's much less frequent. And we've never seen a situation where cougars came into a place where ravens were, but we have seen situations where ravens come into places where cougars were. So this is an example of a cougar kill. Some of you have probably seen this around here, but the cougar caches her food and covers it. And that's done presumably to keep visual predators like ravens from finding it and scavenging on it when she can't get it. So she's covered, she's got a dead deer here, and she's covered it with all this grass. But still, one of our ravens did find this one and is able to get a bit of food from it. This is a territorial bird that's utilizing that. But the relationship of ravens and pumas is much, much less frequent than ravens and wolves. So what about other things? A lot of them are beggars. And this bird was in Yellowstone at a place where tourists stopped to either ski, to go to the bathroom, or to just make other plans. And it would walk up to cars and look directly at the person in the car and often get rewarded. This case, the guy tossed a ham sandwich to this bird. Some of these birds are beggars in the extreme. So this bird, who was called Steve, she's actually a female, so Stevie, in this case, is ringing a bell that the owners of this house put out for her because they were afraid that she was going to break their windows. And the woman inside there, Molly, is a barmaid at the saloon in Cook City, Montana. And they have roast beef night on Wednesdays. And Molly would bring home roast beef. She'd put it out for Steve, and Steve would eat it. And that was a cool thing. She loved it. But again, she's wanted to protect her windows. So Steve rings the bell. She comes out with food, and Steve's happy. And Molly's happy. Nick, Molly's husband, was not so happy about this situation. mainly because of the fact that his bird was tagged. I had no idea that Steve was the mascot of Cook City when I caught her. I mean, sometimes ravens are really hard to catch and they take days, weeks, of mistakes that we don't catch them. When I drove into Cook City, I saw one raven, I put out a bit of suet, and before I could get back in my car, that bird was on the suet. And I was like, well, this is going to be a good day. And I caught her right away and tagged her, let her go. And about 3 months later, I met the school teacher in Cook City. They have a one-room school, 7 kids. And the teacher said, hey, are you the one who tagged that raven in Cook City? I said, yes. She goes, well, the people in Cook City are not happy about this raven being tagged. It was their mascot. She had a bit of a limp and her foot doesn't close all the way. I didn't even notice that when I caught her. But they had, and they'd been feeding her for about a year before I stepped in and put all this stuff on her. And Nick was going to catch her and take those tags off. But fortunately, Nick was from the University of Kentucky. And he let this go because I happened by chance to have put blue and white tags on this bird's leg, which are the colors of the University of Kentucky. So go Wildcats. This bird doesn't just live around Molly and Nick's place. Here's the location. She goes way out of the park, almost up to Bozeman. Again, about 120 or 30 miles across. She's a non-breeder, vagrant bird. Spends a lot of time down in Cody, Wyoming, and the big dark area in the middle is up around Cook City. I got an email from a lawyer one day that said, hey, a friend of mine who lives in the Beartooth Wilderness has a cabin up there. He stays up there and he has this raven now who comes to his cabin and begs for food. And it's tagged. Do you know anything about it? I said, well, I'm not sure, but let's look and see where these locations are. And you can see there's a cluster of points up by Kersey Lake, and then this is Cook City, where Steve spends most of her time. And this cluster up by Kersey Lake happens to be on top of this cabin, which is the one owned by the guy that I got the lawyer's email from, in a friendly way. It wasn't a threatening email. But we decided we should go in, so we bring our dogs in and go in to meet the owner, and I figured this is going to be a crusty old dude who's living up in the Beartooth Wilderness. And it turns out he's an interesting guy. He's the former lieutenant governor of South Dakota. He's got a big cabin up there. He was a big Ducks Unlimited guy, mainly, resource utilization of wildlife. But this raven has changed his mind in terms of connecting with nature and connecting with wildlife. And he's enamored with this bird and asks me all the time, where's it at? What's it doing? What's going on with Steve? And this simple, I think, act here, he's feeding him a little bit. Yes, that's not the best thing to do, but the connection of this guy, strong Republican, with this bird and the natural resources around, I think is worth feeding it a little bit of food. They're also thieves. They can open Ziplocs, they can open zippers, they can open Velcro. They will get whatever you have hidden if it's edible. I just got an email from, this is obviously not in Yellowstone, but in Grand Canyon. He doesn't get any food out of this effort, but often they do. I just got an email from Doug Smith, a wolf researcher in the park, and a friend of his was snowboarding up around Bend, Oregon, and he had gone out snowboarding for the day and left his food in his tent. Zipped up the tent, he comes back, the tent's unzipped, the ravens have been in there and eaten a lot of his food. He decides, like a typical snowboarder, I probably have enough food for another day. So he wraps it up and as the report said, tied 3 knots, buried it about a foot down in the snow, and then went snowboarding for the day. Came back, raven had eaten most of the rest of his food, and he had to give up on the snow boarding trip at that point. So they can be thieves. And they were supposed to be doing this in Old Faithful in the winter when snowmobilers came in there. So I went there to see that. Here's an aerial view of the Old Faithful area. And we have 2 tagged territorial birds there. You can see they pretty much split up the area. They beg from people, but they don't open snowmobiles anymore. And that's because the cultural coevolution between us and ravens has taken a different step in Yellowstone. And now, rather than having saddlebags with Velcro closures on our snowmobiles, we have these hard-sided satchels, and they have locking tops. And the ravens have yet to figure out how to get the keys from the people and open those locks, but it's coming. Undoubtedly, it will be next. And the ravens are not happy about this situation. The white spot on the seat up there, it's not what you think. That's where ravens have actually torn into the seat and ripped it apart. And they are taking out their aggression now on these iron dogs and basically sending the message, hey, this was a good deal for us for a while. Now it's not. What are you going to do about it? So the snowmobile operators, of course, aren't happy about that, but at least people aren't losing their keys and food and other valuables. So this back and forth, this kind of arms race, what we call, Tony and I called cultural coevolution, is just taking a new step here. And it's like, we do one thing, the birds respond, they do something else, that challenges us to do something, and back and forth. And again, I think we've been doing this with these birds for our existence, more than the existence of Homo sapiens, but back to Neanderthal times, several million years, this has been ongoing competition and challenging. And sometimes that allowed us to revere the bird as really great, able to outsmart us. They must be our creator. They must be other important elements in our environment. And at other times, it causes us to worry and take them out of the situation. And that's what's going on now. So we go back to this graph to bring this back to a more conservation message. There are at least 3 species of threatened animals, snowy plovers, greater sage grouse, and desert tortoise, which are on the menu for ravens. And they are definitely one of the reasons that these animals now are threatened. But they're like the last reason on the list as far as I'm concerned. And maybe I'm a little biased being a raven guy, but it doesn't help sage grouse that we've taken out most of the sage and we're not replanting most of the sage. And so we've concentrated them into small areas where predators that they co-evolved with are now able to have a stronger effect. Same thing with snowy plovers on our beaches, and same thing with desert tortoises in the Mojave. We've limited the places where those animals can live, and we've supplemented everything around it with foods that ravens can thrive on. And so what our research in Yellowstone has shown is that things like all of the waste treatment plants, all of the landfills, some of the agricultural areas, and the hunting practices in an area can greatly influence the carrying capacity of that land for ravens. And if those happen to be near places where snowy plovers or grouse or desert tortoises are, that's going to be a real problem because we've just brought all these predators into that situation. So our research would say, reduce those subsidies, figure out which ones are where that are near a sage grouse lek or whatever, and do what we can to reduce the use of those by ravens. But that's not what we're doing. What we're doing is killing ravens. And we're killing, this is the number of ravens killed from 1995 to 2020 by the federal government. And we're killing 10,000 ravens or more a year now on behalf of agricultural products as well as endangered species or threatened species. And it's not having any effect. The endangered species are still endangered. The ravens are still increasing. So what we need to do is basically work on the situations where we can have an effect. And that's the places where our subsidies intersect with the resources that these rare species need. And when that happens, there are lots of technologies being developed to armor the places like a landfill with lasers, to put out fake baby tortoises that explode when a raven touches it. It doesn't kill them, but it scares the heck out of them, and will teach them not to prey upon baby tortoises. There's lots of strategies we can do to have the direct effect where we need it, rather than just basically killing a bunch of ravens. But if we don't, this is what will happen. They will take over all of the resources that we put out there and utilize them and fuel their population as a result. So I hope we can do something to have a positive effect, sustainable effect on our threatened species and the species like ravens that are incidentally preying upon them. So with that, I would thank you for your attention. I will call your attention to a few things. If you want more detailed, any more detailed information on ravens, you could go to the Avian Conservation Lab website for the University of Washington. I have lots of our papers posted there. If you're interested in crows, we didn't talk about crows tonight, but I'm glad to answer questions about them. But Colleen and I have worked with a couple of gamers and children's book our authors to develop a free app called Crow Scientist. You can get that. It's a great way to get kids involved with collecting behavioral data on the crows. It goes through vocalizations and different postures and things, and they can keep track of that and win awards for doing it. If you want to follow our ravens in Yellowstone, the free app Animal Tracker from the Max Planck Institute has our birds on it. And you can put that on your phone and see kind of where those birds are, when they were last seen, and that sort of thing. So that's kind of fun if you're interested in doing that. And then there are some books for sale in the back that I'd be glad to sign if you're interested in getting those. And otherwise, if you have questions or questions from Zoom land, I'm glad to take those. But thanks again for your attention. Can I answer? Yes. Okay.
So
Dan.
one of my favorite books of all time is Ravens in Winter. I mean, assign it to my students sometimes because of the scientific method, how we go through that. I believe he uses the word gangs. Gangs. He's talking about those vagrant ravens. How's that changed, and how does it burn when you think about those uses of that word? And the concept of gangless has some sort of social construct in it, but it apparently doesn't. Yeah, so I mean, I love Bern. We spent a lot of time with Bern doing my postdoc up there, and Colleen and I working there. He likes to use words like that are pretty loaded, and it's very effective at getting people's attention. And for example, that vocalization I played of the young birds calling when they're hungry, he called a yell. Not really a yell. They're not yelling, hey, come over. You know, it's like, I'm hungry. That's what they're saying. I'm hungry. So I think the word gang for the vagrant non-territorial birds, it's an effective thing. They do kind of gain strength in numbers to overpower a dominant pair. That really does work that way. But they're not in any way cohesive. They're not, you know, tats that keep them together or other symbols that they use to stay together by any means. They are individuals moving around that occasionally accumulate at a place and use strength in numbers to get what they want. It's not a social group. And I don't think that any of the other concepts of what we think of as a gang have anything to do with what those birds are doing. Yeah, no, haven't seen that. So yeah, but it's and you know, Bern has been involved with this work, and he knows exactly what we're finding. And I think he's been as surprised as any of us at the mobility of these animals and their ability to track so many different resources over such a large area. Yeah.
So the electronic trackers you put on these birds, are they designed to eventually just fall off, or how does that work?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Obviously, whenever we tag a bird, we're concerned about the bird's welfare and how long it's gonna have to carry that. I do not design them to come off. I put them on so they won't come off, because the worst thing, in my opinion, is when they come off halfway and the bird gets hung up in a tree somewhere. So we put these on to stay on for life. And in fact, with those solar chargers now, these birds, some of them in Europe are carrying birds for 15 or carrying tags for 15 years and still getting data. So they can still provide information over a long time period. We could catch the birds again in some cases and take the tags off, but actually the birds are taking them off now. And so what they're doing, I didn't bring my tag here, but there are 4 places where Teflon straps go into the tag and then around the bird. And basically their partners are breaking one of those places off, and then tag slides off. So we can recover the tag, see, oh, it's broken, and it's almost always broken at the same spot, and identify, hopefully see that bird alive again as well without the tag, but at least know that it's not that the bird died in that case, but the tag was shed. So that's a kind of a long answer, but we're concerned about it. It's just, anytime you put these tags on, you're having an effect on the birds, no doubt. And we're just trying to get the most information we can from it when we do that. They weigh 30 grams, so they're 3% of the bird's body weight. And that's what we are regulated to do by the bird banding lab, that amount or less. Yeah.
So since there is wolves on the landscape now in Yellowstone, and is there any direct correlation between population increase of ravens since they have access to wolf kills? And I'm concerned that that could be another reason why people in agriculture would want to kill wolves.
Yeah.
See any connection?
Yeah, we did 10 years of data on that where we went with my class when we were in Yellowstone one day in March and counted all the ravens we could in the park. We did those of you who've done breeding bird survey routes. There are 2 routes in Yellowstone. We did those and counted ravens in each of those. We counted all the ravens at the kills because we had pilots up looking for the kills. And we counted at some of the anthropogenic places like the dumps. So we have estimates for 10 years of how many ravens were there, and it is correlated with the abundance of wolves that are there. But it's more correlated, not so much the overall abundance of ravens, but where they are. If there's more wolf activity, more wolf kills, less snow, unlike this year, most of the ravens are in the park. If in a year like this year, which was record snowfall in Yellowstone, and all the big animals from Yellowstone left the park, and 1,400 bison were killed by native indigenous hunters outside the park, all of our ravens were there. And so we get about the same number, but now a totally different distribution, all outside of the park. So the presence of wolves can influence where the ravens are much more so than the overall abundance. But there's got to be some positive increase in raven numbers because of this carrion. It's providing food more stably over the year rather than, as with hunting, a pulse in the fall or a pulse in the spring for the indigenous hunting there. So it's a more stable, and therefore you would expect a resource that could support a larger number of birds. But it's not a huge effect. It's more of a distributional shift. Yeah.
That's the spike in the number of ravens. So I'm just wondering if it kept going, and would there be balance as long as?
Well, eventually no population increases exponentially forever. There's only one right now that's really been doing that for a long time, and it's us, right? And so we've been increasing our resource base. Ravens haven't hit a carrying capacity yet. Those data were right up until last year. And so they're still on an increasing trajectory. And until we do something about those subsidies, because some of them are so rich and available all the time. I mean, think about there are so many wastewater treatment ponds across the West. I never knew there were so many until we saw all these data. They're like, oh, what's under that? When you zoom in on Google Earth, oh, that's a wastewater treatment plant. Oh, there's another one. So they know where these places are and they use them. And that's like a continuous refreshed food base every day. And so it's not the typical kind of resource that they can reduce. It's kind of unlimited right now. So there will eventually be a point where there aren't territories. So the population might stabilize with a lot of non-breeders and a few territories that are saturation of the space for breeding. But there'll be higher mortality then, and the population will eventually level. But I don't know when. It's not going to be anytime soon, I don't think. There are some things. Great horned owls prey upon them, and a lot of our breeders are killed by owls. Goshawks occasionally take some. Wolves occasionally kill them, and humans kill them a lot. So there are some predators, but for the most part, they're at the top of the bird. They're big animals, and most predatory birds can't get them. Golden eagles definitely take a lot as well. So there's some, but it's minimal relative to just the flood of fat and other things we put out there that they're able to eat. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know if other corvids like crows and jays are following that same trajectory? Because here, at least right in town, it seems like it's more the crows that are our scavengers and getting into the garbage and foraging off the birds.
Yeah, crows show the same trajectory in the West, especially. There was a little bit of a pause with West Nile virus that killed a lot of crows, but not so much in the West Coast, but across the Midwest where their populations are large. But yes, their populations have increased exponentially, not so much for jays. And the reason is that jays are mostly a forest species, and we've reduced the amount of forest on the landscape. Crows are an urban and edge species, and we've increased the amount of urban space and suburban and agricultural space. So we've made a lot of crow habitat over the years. We've reduced jay habitat. And so crow numbers and raven numbers have increased and not so much the other corvids.
There's a question online about like contamination due to gut piles.
Yeah, so contamination at gut piles is primarily from lead. Lead ammunition used to kill the animal, and those fragments of lead remain in the gut piles. And there is contamination of ravens. That was tested around Jackson, and they showed high levels of lead. It didn't kill many birds. We thought one of our first birds that died was a lead poisoning case, but it was inconclusive that it was. And they seem very good. Scavengers seem very good at being able to process those sorts of contaminants. But lead, if they get enough of it, will definitely kill them. A lot of hunters in the West are using non-lead bullets, so it hopefully is becoming less of an effect. And it doesn't, again, if ravens suffer that fate, it's not as bad as some of the rarer species, which ravens are sentinel for, golden eagles, bald eagles, but especially golden eagles that also heavily use these gut piles and are contaminated and have suffered a lot because of that. Yep.
For a couple other questions, I was really wondering, right, graph with the red line.
Yes.
Correlation. I was wondering if you think that the raven wolf distance correlation might be stronger now if wolves had not been extirpated for so many raven generations. Yes. But then with the whole wastewater thing, maybe they would have found other sources anyway. So I was just wondering if that knowledge base is lost or generations of not witnessing out wolves made an impact.
Yeah, I think it probably did. I mean, that's the interesting thing to me is ravens have been able to play wolves and people basically very well through their evolutionary history. And they don't really need both. They could get by with just wolves, their numbers would be less. They could get by with just humans, which they did, as you point out, for a long period of time, in the West, at least, Western US. But they also, in Canada, there were ravens and wolves interacting. We know that our birds go up there and theirs probably come down. So there could be some traditional knowledge remaining at when wolves were reintroduced. There were ravens right away on the first wolf kills made in the park. So, and that's, to me, was, I really wouldn't have suspected it. But I mean, it's such a, for a raven, you see a slaughter of red on the snow and all this food, they couldn't help themselves but going in and trying to get at it. They might have gotten better at utilizing it now, maybe better at knowing where to expect it, like with these birds that might fly in, 100 miles, figuring they're going to find something there. So they've probably gotten a stronger relationship now than they had 25 years ago when the wolves were first there. But they pretty much knew the game when it started too. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if the fact that they had such a good relationship with human resources before wolves would have kept them from, abandoning those human resources. That's the one thing is I think there's inertia to stay and, make sure you still check in at the Thriftway and because there could be a pizza in the back lot or go to that wastewater treatment plant because food's there and you don't want to lose that knowledge. So, yeah, I think they basically adapt and shift pretty quickly. But it would help if there had been wolves there the whole time. It would be interesting to see how different that was. All right.
I have one question. So how have you ever got any information about how it was before the wolves?
In terms of numbers of ravens, unfortunately, no, nothing quantitative that we can compare to what we know now in terms of the numbers.
But they were there.
There were ravens there, absolutely. And they were begging from tourists and they were eating fat from the waste. They were doing all of those human resources, absolutely. And they were also, again, most of what they do in the summer is eat invertebrates. They were certainly doing all of that. They were doing all of that. And that's kind of the question here is they had that whole repertoire down and that's all they did for 50 years. And then
Don't know how many there.
we just don't know how many there were. but we certainly have no reason to suspect they weren't doing all those same things. And now you just throw another rich food source into the mix. And yeah, they don't shift and just rely upon wolves, but instead they continue that human reliance and add wolves to it.
Well, thanks very much,
You
John.
bet.
That was